looking at the black thing on the back of the truck, that to me it's a black thing on the back of the truck. That is not the Shahida flag where you can see the inscription that you'd normally see on jihadists at first look. So it may well be terrorist motivated. They're looking at that, but you always have to keep your powder slightly dry on this, because there are far more domestic terrorists in the US than there are international terrorists, and that's the way that they look at it in terms of their approach to terrorism.
The suspect accused of ploughing a truck through a crowd in New Orleans earlier this morning has been named by a law enforcement source as 42-year-old Shamsuddin Jabba. Police fatally shot him after the attack, which killed 10 people and injured 35. According to a local news outlet in New Orleans known as NOLA, it said Jabba was carrying an ISIS flag in the truck, and authorities have said he was dressed in military gear. We've heard that the FBI are treating this as a terrorist attack. Let's speak more about this with Major General Chip Chapman, who's a former senior British military advisor and former head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence. Chip, Happy New Year to you.
And the same to you, Nick.
I'm sorry that we're talking about this dreadful story on what should be a more celebratory and forward-looking day, but we're grateful to you for breaking into your bank holiday to speak to us. Now, I imagine that when you were in post, you would have a lot of conversations with your American counterparts about terrorist threats. This is one that has potentially got through the net. What kind of information gathering exercise will be going on right now?
Well, the main thing is you exploit all his media accounts, both his phone, social media, and all that, to see join the dots in terms of the network between those. It's sort of the hop searching, as we call it, to see if this is a lone individual or if this is part of a network, because you're always fearful if it's part of a network that things could be worse. Now, I suspect that it wouldn't be. What will be interesting in the next 24 hours in terms of everyone else exploiting that social media is, for example, if he was to the Islamist persuasion, then you would see IS or someone like that, Al-Qaeda, claiming it. If he wasn't, and this was a grievance-based, you'll see people either on the right wing celebrating it, because one of the unusual things about terrorism in the US is there is a predominance of right-wing terrorism, then followed by left-wing terrorism, and then only lastly, religious terrorism, particularly over the period post 1994. So that isn't sort of slightly unusual. So although they're saying that this is terrorist motivated at the moment, and it looks by the thing of his name, for example, you could say that would give you an indicator of maybe a religiously motivated. You can sometimes draw too much from that. So, for example, looking at the black thing on the back of the truck, that to me it's a black thing on the back of the truck. That is not the Shahida flag where you can see the inscription that you'd normally see on jihadists at first look. So it may well be terrorist motivated. They're looking at that, but you always have to keep your powder slightly dry on this, because there are far more domestic terrorists in the US than there are international terrorists, and that's the way that they look at it in terms of their approach to terrorism.
We're still awaiting another press conference from the authorities in New Orleans, which was scheduled for 5 o'clock. It's obviously been put back, and I imagine they'll be looking at some of the information and some of the clues that you've been talking about. You said halfway through your answer, your instinct was that this was potentially a lone wolf attack. What are the hallmarks of the attack that made you perhaps lean in that direction?
Well, if you look at the UK attacks that we've had, which used vehicle as a weapon, as a mode of transport, particularly in things like the one at Westminster Bridge, generally they're a single man. If there are a number of them, which we also saw at the fishmongers one, then there would be shooters alongside that. So, for example, in America, the prevalence of and ease of getting guns means that you would probably have other people there. Now, this is again one of the major differences between the UK and the US. The vehicle as a weapon is a low entry point. That is, you only need really an ability to drive a car. It's very difficult in the UK to get weapons. We know that the assailant in this case shot at 2 officers. But rather like the attack in Germany at Magdeburg recently, it seems to be that he may have got over an obstacle in a New Year's Eve environment, crowded places methodology in the UK, we would definitely look at the protect part of the counter-terrorist strategy, and therefore you factor in things to do with density, confinement, and access, and lack of access to these crowded places, which the French Quarter in New Orleans would. So not only has there been a failure in this guy being allowed to do his heinous act, but also there's a failure in protective security measures here.
I imagine that terrorist threats, attacks, suspicious people, people with records who have a social media presence which suggests they're leaning towards violent thinking and violent ideologies are to a penny, certainly across the United States. But this is someone, as you say, who has fallen through the gaps. How much frustration will there be that this has happened, or is it just one of those realizations that you're not going to catch everyone?
Well, that is a truism that you're not going to catch everyone. So even though the IA is now used in machine learning, the number of subjects of interest and closed subjects of interest, either in the UK and the US, means that you can have tens of thousands of people on the radar. But the one thing that artificial intelligence cannot give you is the trigger point for an individual. It is not good at articulating and predicting societal and social outcomes. And again, rather like the UK, there have been a number of times when there have been people who've either been a subject of interest or a closed subject of interest who suddenly have become the one who's attacked. And the reason that they weren't one of the top on the prioritization grid is because there are people who were far higher. You thought there was intent of attack planning. So what you can say about this guy is he had no intent of attack planning from a security forces perspective. Unfortunately, a threat is both intent, capability, and opportunity. He obviously did have the intent, and somewhere like the crowded place on a New Year's Eve, he had the opportunity. It is an unusual time. I mean, 03:15, it is going to be pretty crowded on New Year's Eve on New Orleans. But one of the things about terrorism also is the sort of publicity of terrorism, and you like to sort of have the blaze of publicity in terms of this being captured in daylight on film. So it is an unusual time, but it would have been a crowded place on New Year's Eve.
Lots of insight to think about. Thank you very much indeed, Major General Chip Chapman, former senior British military advisor and head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence.